What if the person you admire most believes they deserve the least? The ballroom shimmered beneath elegant chandeliers as soft piano music drifted through the air, filling the annual charity gala with warmth rather than extravagance. Community leaders, business owners, teachers, firefighters, and local families gathered to celebrate another successful year of giving back, but among all the polished conversations and formal smiles stood Ethan Brooks, a 42-year-old single father who never seemed comfortable being the center of attention. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, yet he carried himself with the quiet humility of a man who had never measured his worth by the clothes he wore or the title on his business card. While others discussed investments and expansion plans, Ethan found himself listening to volunteers describe the new playground the foundation had funded for children recovering from difficult circumstances. Their excitement made him smile more than any business award ever had. Across the ballroom, Grace Mitchell watched him from a respectful distance. As one of the nation's most respected interior architects, she had been invited to design several community spaces sponsored by Ethan's company, and during the past year she had quietly discovered that every impressive project seemed to reflect the same invisible quality as the man behind it. Kindness always came before recognition. Compassion always arrived before applause. She had seen Ethan stay long after meetings ended to stack folding chairs with volunteers. She had watched him personally thank cafeteria workers during fundraising events while other executives hurried toward television cameras. She had once noticed him kneeling beside a frightened little boy whose balloon had floated into the ceiling, patiently finding another one before anyone realized the child had started crying. Ethan never mentioned those moments. He simply moved on as though goodness required no audience. The evening slowly settled into comfortable laughter, soft music, and heartfelt speeches celebrating generosity. Near the end of the event, guests gathered beside large windows overlooking the sparkling Chicago skyline. Golden reflections danced across the glass while quiet conversations blended with distant traffic far below. Grace stepped beside Ethan, holding 2 cups of coffee she had collected moments earlier. She handed him one with a gentle smile. "You looked like you forgot to enjoy your own event," she said warmly. Ethan laughed softly, accepting the cup. "I usually do." They stood together for several peaceful moments without needing to fill the silence. Sometimes comfort arrived not through endless conversation but through shared stillness. Ethan looked toward the city lights before speaking again, his voice carrying the weight of years he rarely discussed. "You know," he said with an embarrassed smile, "sometimes I wonder why someone like you even spends time talking to someone like me." Grace looked at him with quiet surprise. Ethan chuckled lightly, trying to hide the sincerity behind his words. "You are too good for me." The sentence sounded almost playful, but his eyes revealed something deeper. Years of raising his daughter alone after losing his wife had quietly convinced him that happiness belonged more naturally to other people. Grace did not laugh. She did not dismiss his feelings or rush to change the subject. Instead, she held his gaze with calm certainty, her expression filled not with sympathy but with complete confidence. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that seemed capable of healing old doubts without speaking loudly. "That," she said gently, "is exactly why I chose you." The music continued. Glasses quietly clinked across the ballroom. Conversations faded into the background. Yet for Ethan, the entire room suddenly felt silent because no one had ever answered his deepest insecurity with such simple and unwavering grace. For several long seconds Ethan could not find a single word. The sounds of the charity gala slowly returned around him, gentle laughter rising from nearby tables, quiet jazz floating through the ballroom, and the distant hum of conversations blending with the glittering lights beyond the windows. Yet everything felt strangely different, as though Grace's simple answer had reached a place inside his heart that had remained untouched for years. He lowered his eyes with an almost embarrassed smile and shook his head gently. "You should not say things like that," he whispered. "People might think you have terrible judgment." Grace laughed softly, not because the joke was especially clever, but because she recognized what hid beneath it. Ethan had spent so many years disguising self-doubt as humor that even kindness made him uncomfortable. She leaned lightly against the window overlooking downtown Chicago, watching headlights move like quiet rivers below. "You always make yourself the smallest person in every room," she said gently. Ethan shrugged. "It is easier that way." Grace looked at him carefully. "For who?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the reflection of the ballroom lights dancing across the glass. His silence carried memories he rarely allowed anyone to see. After his wife passed away nearly 8 years earlier, life had become wonderfully simple and painfully lonely at the same time. Every morning began before sunrise. He prepared breakfast, packed lunches, braided his daughter Lily's hair as neatly as he could, drove her to school, managed an expanding business throughout the day, then hurried home in time to help with homework before reading bedtime stories. Friends admired his strength. Employees admired his leadership. Neighbors admired his devotion as a father. Ethan appreciated every compliment, yet none of them ever changed the quiet belief that somewhere along the journey he had stopped seeing himself as someone worthy of beginning again. Grace had noticed that long before this evening. During project meetings he always thanked everyone else first. At community events he stood behind volunteers instead of beside photographers. When newspapers praised his charitable work, he redirected every interview toward the organizations rather than himself. Humility had become so deeply woven into his character that he no longer recognized where kindness ended and self-neglect began. Grace finally broke the silence. "Do you know what I saw the first time we met?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Probably a man carrying too many folders." She laughed again. "No. I saw a father who stopped an important meeting because his daughter called to tell him she had earned the lead role in her school play." Ethan looked surprised that she remembered. "You answered the phone on the first ring," Grace continued. "You congratulated her like she had just won an Olympic gold medal. Then you apologized to everyone in the conference room for taking 30 seconds to celebrate your child." Ethan looked down quietly. "I thought that was unprofessional." "No," Grace replied with complete certainty. "It was unforgettable." The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the evening drew closer to its end. Volunteers began collecting programs from empty tables while guests slowly prepared to leave. Ethan held his untouched cup of coffee, now barely warm, realizing he had spent years believing his greatest value came from what he could do for other people. Grace had quietly become the first person determined to convince him that his greatest value had always been who he already was, and neither of them realized that the conversation beginning beside that window would soon change far more than two hearts. The charity gala ended quietly, but neither Ethan nor Grace carried the evening home in the same way they had arrived. Long after the ballroom lights faded behind them and the streets of downtown Chicago settled into the peaceful rhythm of late evening, Ethan found himself replaying her words during the drive home. They had been spoken so gently that anyone else might have forgotten them by morning. He could not. They followed him through every traffic light, every familiar street, and every quiet mile until he finally pulled into the driveway of the modest home where the porch light always waited for him. Before he could even unlock the front door, it swung open. 12-year-old Lily rushed outside wearing oversized socks and a bright smile that erased the exhaustion from his face. "You made it before bedtime," she said happily. Ethan smiled as she wrapped her arms around him. "I promised I would." Inside, the house carried the comforting scent of cinnamon from cookies Lily had baked with their elderly neighbor earlier that evening. Family photographs covered one hallway, each picture quietly documenting a life built not on perfection but on perseverance. Ethan helped Lily finish a school science project at the kitchen table, listened carefully as she described every detail of an upcoming field trip, and laughed when glitter somehow ended up on both of their sleeves instead of the poster board. Those ordinary moments had become his favorite part of every day. Across the city, Grace sat alone in her apartment overlooking the Chicago River, holding a cup of herbal tea while rain lightly tapped against the windows. The city lights shimmered across the water, but her thoughts remained with Ethan. She remembered the first project they had completed together nearly a year earlier. A local children's library had asked her to redesign its reading rooms, while Ethan's company volunteered to build custom bookshelves without charging a single dollar. During one afternoon at the construction site, Grace had quietly stepped into an unfinished reading corner and found Ethan sitting on the dusty floor beside 3 neighborhood children whose parents had arrived early. Instead of discussing budgets or construction schedules, he was reading a storybook aloud with animated voices that made every child laugh. One little girl climbed into his lap halfway through the story as though she had known him forever. Ethan never noticed Grace watching from the doorway. When the children's parents arrived to pick them up, he simply returned to measuring wooden shelves as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Grace never forgot that afternoon because it revealed something impossible to manufacture. Compassion was not something Ethan practiced when people were watching. It was simply the way he moved through the world. The following morning sunlight poured through the windows of Ethan's woodworking factory, filling the spacious workshop with the rich scent of freshly cut oak and maple. Craftsmen greeted him warmly as they prepared another day's orders. Ethan walked through the building, stopping to ask about families, birthdays, and weekend plans before discussing production schedules. Several employees smiled after he passed because they knew their employer remembered details most people overlooked. Standing quietly near the entrance, Grace watched the morning unfold before Ethan noticed she had arrived. She had come to review furniture designs for an upcoming community center, but instead she found herself smiling at the same quiet truth she had discovered many months earlier. Every place Ethan entered became a little warmer, not because he demanded respect, but because he freely gave it first, and without realizing it, he was teaching everyone around him what genuine leadership truly looked like. Grace spent the rest of the morning reviewing architectural drawings with Ethan's design team, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the workshop beyond the glass conference room. Sunlight streamed through the tall factory windows, illuminating floating specks of sawdust that shimmered like tiny stars above rows of carefully crafted furniture. The steady rhythm of sanding, measuring, and quiet conversation filled the building with a sense of purpose that could never be manufactured. Every employee moved with confidence because they knew they were respected long before they were evaluated. During a short break, Ethan invited Grace to walk through the production floor. He greeted every craftsman by name, asked one employee about his son's baseball tournament, congratulated another on her college graduation, and reminded a young apprentice not to skip lunch because good work always begins with taking care of yourself. Grace noticed that every conversation ended with genuine smiles instead of polite nods. The atmosphere felt more like an extended family than a successful company. As they reached the back of the workshop, Ethan stopped beside a newly completed reading bench designed for a neighborhood literacy program. He gently brushed a hand across the smooth oak surface before speaking almost to himself. "I always imagine the children who will sit here before I think about the project itself." Grace looked at him with quiet admiration. Most people would talk about profit first. Ethan smiled modestly. "The numbers matter because they allow us to keep helping people. The people matter because they are the reason the numbers should exist." His answer settled gently into the peaceful space between them. Grace realized that every conversation she had ever shared with Ethan somehow returned to the same simple truth. He never separated success from service. That afternoon they drove together to inspect the nearly completed community center they had spent months planning. Fresh paint filled the bright hallways with a clean scent while afternoon sunlight poured through oversized windows, warming polished wooden floors and colorful reading areas designed for children and families. Volunteers arranged books on shelves built by Ethan's team while local teachers prepared classrooms for their first visitors. Grace quietly watched as Ethan wandered away from the official tour. At the far end of the building, an elderly volunteer struggled to carry several heavy storage boxes across the lobby. Without hesitation, Ethan set aside his jacket, lifted the boxes with an easy smile, and carried them to the supply room while listening patiently to stories about the woman's grandchildren. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no board members nearby. Nobody would ever know the moment had happened except Grace. When Ethan returned, he looked slightly embarrassed after realizing she had seen everything. "She reminded me of my mother," he explained softly. Grace shook her head with a gentle smile. "You do not have to explain kindness to me anymore." They continued walking through the quiet building until they reached the children's reading room overlooking a small community garden. Grace paused beside the wide windows where warm afternoon light spilled across colorful rugs and handcrafted bookshelves. She turned toward Ethan, her expression calm yet filled with unmistakable certainty. "Do you know when I stopped admiring your work and started admiring you?" Ethan looked genuinely surprised. He slowly shook his head. Grace smiled, remembering every small act of compassion she had quietly witnessed over the past year. "It happened the day I realized you treated every stranger with the same care you gave your daughter. That was the moment I understood your heart had already become the safest place I had ever known." Ethan stood completely still, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes, because for the first time in many years someone had fallen in love not with what he had built, but with the quiet man he had tried so hard to keep unnoticed. The afternoon sun lingered across the windows of the community center as Ethan and Grace slowly walked through the nearly completed building, neither of them rushing to fill the silence. Outside, children laughed in a nearby playground while a gentle autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the open courtyard. Everything around them seemed peaceful, yet Ethan felt a quiet uneasiness growing inside his heart. Grace's words had reached places he had carefully protected for years, and he was no longer certain whether opening those doors would bring healing or more loss. He stopped beside a handcrafted wooden bench overlooking the small garden and rested both hands against its smooth surface. "There is something I have never told you," he said softly. Grace sat beside him without speaking, giving him the rare gift of patient silence. Ethan looked toward the colorful flowers swaying gently beneath the afternoon light before continuing. "After my wife passed away, people kept telling me that one day life would feel normal again." He smiled faintly, though sadness quietly lingered behind his eyes. "They meant well, but they were wrong. Life never became normal. It simply became different." Grace listened with complete attention, never interrupting. Ethan drew a slow breath. The hardest part was never learning how to cook dinner or help Lily with homework. The hardest part was believing that if I ever allowed myself to be happy again, somehow I would be leaving part of my past behind. The words settled gently between them. Grace understood that grief was never something to be defeated. It was something people learned to carry with love. Ethan continued quietly. "There were nights when Lily finally fell asleep, and I would sit alone in the living room wondering if I had already experienced the happiest chapter of my life. I convinced myself that my job was simply to become the best father I could be. Nothing more." Grace reached over and lightly placed her hand beside his on the wooden bench, close enough for him to know she was there but never asking him to move closer. "Do you know what I hear when you say those things?" she asked gently. Ethan slowly shook his head. "I hear a man who loved deeply," she replied. "I hear a father who kept every promise he made to his family. I do not hear someone who has stopped deserving happiness." Ethan looked down, unable to answer immediately. The afternoon light reflected across the polished wood as leaves drifted quietly through the garden. For years he had accepted every compliment about his business, every thank you from the community, and every expression of gratitude from employees, yet somehow he had never learned how to receive kindness directed toward himself. Grace smiled with quiet warmth. "Your heart did not become smaller because it was broken," she whispered. "It became larger because it learned compassion through pain." Ethan felt his eyes grow moist, though he quickly laughed at himself with gentle embarrassment. "Lily would tell you I always become emotional when someone says something nice." Grace laughed softly beside him. She would probably be right. They remained together in comfortable silence until Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lighter than before. "I have spent years believing that opening another chapter would somehow erase the last one. Grace slowly turned toward him with complete certainty shining in her eyes. "No, Ethan," she said. "The people who truly love us never ask us to stop living. They hope we keep finding reasons to smile." As the golden afternoon sunlight quietly settled across the peaceful garden, Ethan realized that the walls protecting his heart had never been built from fear alone. They had been built from loyalty, and for the first time he began believing that moving forward did not mean leaving anyone behind. The conversation in the community garden remained with Ethan long after he returned home that evening. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the rooftops, the familiar routines of fatherhood quietly welcomed him back. Lily was already setting the dinner table, humming a song she had learned in music class while carefully arranging mismatched plates that she insisted made every meal feel more cheerful. Ethan smiled as he joined her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of homemade soup while the comforting aroma of fresh herbs filled the small house. Nothing about the evening appeared extraordinary, yet Grace's words echoed gently through his thoughts with every ordinary moment. After dinner, Lily carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate into the living room and curled up beside her father on the old gray sofa where they had shared hundreds of bedtime conversations over the years. Rain tapped softly against the windows while a warm lamp cast gentle light across family photographs lining the shelves. Lily looked at her father with quiet curiosity. "You have been smiling a lot today," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "Have I?" She nodded without hesitation. "The kind that reaches your eyes." Ethan lowered his gaze, realizing children often notice the truths adults try to hide. Before he could answer, Lily spoke again. "Is Miss Grace the reason?" Ethan paused for several seconds before smiling with gentle honesty. "She is one of the reasons." Lily wrapped both hands around her mug and looked thoughtfully toward the rain outside. "I like her." Ethan smiled. "I know you do." "She listens," Lily continued. "Most grown-ups hear children. She actually listens." Her simple observation lingered in the quiet room. The following afternoon, Grace visited the house for the first time to deliver updated design sketches for the community center library. Ethan had offered coffee, expecting a short professional meeting, but Lily welcomed Grace with the excitement of greeting an old friend. She eagerly showed her science project, a collection of watercolor paintings, and a birdhouse she and her father had built together over the summer. Grace admired every detail with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that made Lily beam with confidence. Later, while Ethan prepared fresh lemonade in the kitchen, Grace stepped into the backyard where Lily was carefully watering a small flower garden. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in warm golden light as butterflies drifted quietly among blooming flowers. Lily looked up after several peaceful moments and asked the question that neither adult expected. "Will you still come visit us after the library is finished?" Grace knelt beside her, smiling gently. "If your father still wants me around, would be happy to." Lily considered the answer before looking back at her flowers. "I think he does. He just worries too much." Grace laughed softly, touched by the innocent wisdom only children seem to possess. Unseen by either of them, Ethan had stepped onto the back porch carrying 3 glasses of lemonade. He stopped without making a sound as Lily quietly continued. "Daddy always thinks people deserve someone better than him. I wish he could see himself the way everyone else does." Ethan stood perfectly still, his heart suddenly heavier and lighter at the same time. Hearing those words from his daughter carried a truth no compliment from friends, employees, or strangers had ever reached. Grace slowly looked toward the porch, meeting Ethan's eyes across the peaceful backyard. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. In the gentle silence between blooming flowers, children's laughter drifting from neighboring yards, and the warm glow of the setting sun, Ethan understood that the greatest obstacle standing between him and happiness had never been the past. It had always been the way he quietly measured his own worth. The quiet conversation in the backyard marked the beginning of something none of them tried to force. Days slowly turned into weeks, and Grace became a familiar part of Ethan and Lily's ordinary life, not through grand promises but through countless small moments that quietly stitched 3 lives together. Some Saturday morning she arrived with fresh pastries from the neighborhood bakery before joining Ethan and Lily at the kitchen table where laughter often lasted longer than breakfast itself. Other afternoons she helped Lily practice speeches for school presentations, applauding every attempt with the same sincere enthusiasm whether the words came out perfectly or not. Ethan watched those moments with growing gratitude, realizing that Grace never tried to impress anyone. She simply cared, and somehow that made every ordinary day feel extraordinary. One crisp Saturday, the community center officially opened its doors to local families after nearly a year of planning. Colorful balloons lined the entrance while children hurried excitedly toward the reading rooms, parents explored activity spaces, and volunteers welcomed neighbors with warm smiles. Sunlight poured through the large windows, filling every corner with warmth that reflected from handcrafted bookshelves, polished wooden tables, and bright murals painted by local artists. Ethan stood near the entrance greeting visitors, but his attention drifted whenever he noticed Grace kneeling beside children, helping them choose books or patiently listening to stories they could not wait to tell. Lily spent the morning proudly giving tours of the reading room she insisted was the most magical place in the whole building. Several guests quietly commented that Ethan and Grace made a wonderful team. Ethan smiled politely, though part of him still wondered whether happiness could truly become something permanent instead of temporary. As the afternoon celebration slowly came to an end, volunteers began folding chairs while families carried home craft projects and borrowed books. Lily tugged gently on Grace's sleeve. "Come with me," she whispered. Grace followed her into the small community garden behind the building where butterflies drifted above blooming flowers and a wooden swing overlooked a peaceful walking path. Lily sat on the swing, gently pushing herself back and forth before looking up with complete honesty. "Can I ask you something?" Grace smiled warmly. "You can ask me anything." Lily hesitated only a moment. "Will you still be here next year?" Grace felt her heart soften. She sat beside the swing so they were at the same eye level. "If your father wants me in your lives," she answered quietly, "then I would love to be here next year, and the year after that too." Lily's smile grew brighter than the afternoon sunlight. "I hope he asks." At that exact moment Ethan stepped through the garden gate carrying 2 empty boxes left behind by volunteers. He had not intended to interrupt, but Lily's final words stopped him where he stood. Neither Grace nor Lily noticed him immediately. Lily looked toward the flowers before speaking again with innocent certainty. "I think my dad forgot that people can choose him too." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by the quiet truth carried in his daughter's voice. Grace slowly turned and saw him standing only a few steps away. Their eyes met across the peaceful garden, and no explanation was needed. Ethan finally understood that everyone he loved had already forgiven him for surviving the past. The only person still withholding that same grace was the man looking back at them from within his own heart, and in that gentle afternoon silence, surrounded by flowers, children's laughter, and the promise of new beginnings, he quietly decided it was finally time to choose himself with the same compassion he had spent years giving to everyone else. Several weeks later the community gathered once again, this time inside the newly completed civic auditorium where local leaders, volunteers, teachers, and families celebrated the official dedication of the Neighborhood Education Initiative. Warm lights filled the spacious hall while children proudly displayed artwork created in the community center that Ethan's company and Grace's design had helped bring to life. Laughter drifted through the room, conversations blended with gentle piano music, and photographs of smiling families rotated across large screens near the stage. Ethan stood quietly near the back of the audience, just as he always preferred, applauding every volunteer who accepted recognition while hoping no one would notice he had slipped away from the front row. Grace found him standing beside a window overlooking the evening skyline. She smiled knowingly. "You disappeared again." Ethan laughed softly. "The volunteers deserve tonight, not me." Grace looked toward the stage where children accepted certificates with proud smiles. "You helped build all of this." Ethan gently shook his head. Hundreds of people built this. I simply carried a few boards. Before Grace could answer, the master of ceremonies unexpectedly invited Ethan to the stage, thanking him for years of quiet service that had transformed countless community projects. The audience applauded warmly as Ethan reluctantly walked toward the microphone with the same humble smile he always carried whenever attention found him. He thanked the organizers, recognized every volunteer by name that he could remember, praised the teachers, the construction crews, the donors, and the families who had trusted the vision long before it became reality. Then he paused, looking briefly toward Grace sitting among the guests. His expression softened with quiet honesty. There was a time, he said gently, when I believed the best years of my life were already behind me. I thought my purpose was simply to work hard, raise my daughter well, and quietly stay out of the way. I convinced myself that some people deserved happiness more than I did. The auditorium grew completely silent. Ethan smiled with humble embarrassment before continuing. I even told someone recently that she was too good for me. Soft laughter spread through the audience as Grace lowered her eyes with a warm smile. Ethan took a slow breath. Looking back now, I realized the problem was never that she saw too much good in me. The problem was that I had forgotten how to see it myself. He stepped away from the podium and walked calmly toward Grace. Every conversation in the room faded into respectful silence. He stopped in front of her without drama or performance, speaking quietly enough that everyone instinctively leaned closer to hear. Grace, he said with complete sincerity, thank you for believing in me before I remembered how to believe in myself. Grace stood, her eyes bright with quiet emotion. She gently took his hand without hesitation. I never chose perfection, she answered softly. I chose kindness. I chose character. I chose the man who spent years making everyone else's life brighter without ever asking for anything in return. The room remained perfectly still. No one reached for applause because the moment itself felt too genuine to interrupt. Ethan smiled through grateful eyes, finally understanding that love was never about proving someone wrong or earning approval. It was about allowing another person to see the truth hidden beneath years of quiet doubt. As the audience watched the two of them standing together beneath the warm stage lights, they did not witness a grand romantic gesture. They witnessed something far more enduring. They witnessed two hearts choosing honesty over fear, dignity over insecurity, and hope over the quiet loneliness that had once seemed impossible to leave behind. 1 year quietly passed, carrying with it countless ordinary moments that slowly became the greatest treasures of all. The seasons changed across Chicago, the trees outside Ethan's home welcomed another spring, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm that none of them had dared to imagine during those uncertain days when doubt had spoken louder than hope. Every morning began with the comforting sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen while sunlight streamed through wide windows and laughter drifted from one room to another. Lily had grown taller, more confident, and wonderfully independent, yet she still insisted that Saturday mornings belonged to homemade pancakes prepared together. Ethan mixed the batter while Grace pretended to follow the recipe, and Lily laughed every time one pancake turned into an uneven shape that somehow became everyone's favorite. The little house had not become larger, but it had become warmer. Family photographs now filled shelves that had once displayed only business awards. New memories rested peacefully beside old ones, never replacing the past, only honoring it with gratitude. Ethan still spoke about his late wife with gentle respect whenever Lily wanted to remember a favorite family tradition. Grace always listened with quiet understanding because she knew love was never measured by forgetting yesterday. It was measured by having the courage to keep loving today. At the woodworking company, very little had changed on the surface. Ethan still greeted every employee by name each morning, carried his own coffee, thanked custodians before entering meetings, and quietly visited the workshop floor before walking into his office. Grace continued designing community spaces that brought families together, mentoring young architects with the same patience she had always offered. Together they expanded projects supporting libraries, schools, and neighborhood centers, believing success should always leave kindness behind wherever it traveled. One warm evening, after volunteering at the community garden that had first witnessed so many life-changing conversations, the three of them walked slowly toward a small hill overlooking Lake Michigan. The sky glowed with soft shades of gold and orange while gentle waves reflected the fading sunlight across the peaceful shoreline. Lily skipped a few steps ahead before turning back with the bright smile that had carried Ethan through every difficult year of his life. Without hesitation she looked toward Grace and called out, "Mom, are you coming?" The single word drifted gently through the evening air. Grace stopped walking for a moment, overcome by quiet emotion. She looked toward Ethan, uncertain whether she had heard correctly, but he simply smiled with grateful eyes that needed no explanation. Lily laughed playfully. "Well, you have been acting like my mom for a long time." Grace knelt to embrace her as Ethan watched the two people he loved most standing together beneath the golden sky. He realized that the greatest gift life had given him was never another chance to be successful. It was another chance to believe that happiness could return without asking him to forget where he had been. As they continued walking together along the peaceful shoreline, 3 sets of footprints slowly formed in the sand before gentle waves quietly softened their edges. Ethan looked toward the horizon and remembered the words he had once spoken with complete conviction, believing he would never be enough for someone like Grace. Now he finally understood the answer she had given him had never been about convincing him he deserved love. It had been about reminding him that true character is not measured by confidence, wealth, or achievement. It is revealed through humility, quiet kindness, unwavering devotion, and the courage to accept grace when someone freely offers it. Sometimes the people who believe they deserve happiness the least become the very ones who protect it the most, and when love chooses a heart shaped by compassion instead of pride, even the quietest life can become the most beautiful home of all.